And that's the north end of the coast redwood forest because it's exactly as described. It's a redwood forest that's dependent on marine-type conditions for its very survival.
Near the summit of Bear Mountain, the train pauses at Cathedral Grove to allow the passengers to view the splendor of this peaceful spot and learn about the majestic redwoods.
It was back in 1847 when Austrian botanists decided that the redwood, this the only known type at the time, was not a member of any of the tree species. So they chose Sequoia's name as the proper title for the redwood family. Now sempervirens, and that's the other half of the name, that's Latin for always living, and that's a good description of the root systems down at the bottom of these trees.
All too soon, the trip up Bear Mountain ends as the train passes by the sawmill and returns to Roaring Camp. Back at Roaring Camp, a Western cookout lunch awaits the hungry passengers. Many times during the year, there is lively noontime entertainment for the whole family to enjoy. The entertainment and nostalgia offered at Roaring Camp draws thousands of people every year. Most patrons aren't aware of how all of this came into being. Roaring Camp was not built by a logging company, railroad, or some other large corporation. Rather, it was the lifelong dream of F. Norman Clark. In 1985, the California Travel Industry Association presented him with its Entrepreneur of the Year award and produced a video presentation about him.
F. Norman Clark believed in the American pioneer's spirit, and he lived it. Born in Los Angeles on June the 25th, 1935, Norm's family has been in railroading for 5 generations, and his passion for preserving railroad equipment began at an early age. His youthful summers were spent commuting by rail to the Los Angeles County Library, where he researched Western railroads and formed dreams of restoring a steam logging railroad of the 1880s. At 14 years old, when other boys were building model railroads, Norm corresponded with railroad presidents and saved historical railroad cars and engines from the scrap heap, and helped establish Los Angeles' famed Griffith Park travel town. In 1953, he founded the Southern California chapter of the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society, and at 20 years old was named president of the National Railroad Museum. After successful years in the insurance industry and as a young railroad executive, Norman Clark decided to live his dream. In 1958, at 23 years old, he convinced a group of investors to acquire a lease on 179 acres of virgin redwood forest in Felton, California, and help him finance the development of a tourist railroad, which would recreate a steam logging railroad of the 1880s. He would call it the Roaring Camp and Big Trees Narrow Gauge Railroad. Upon arrival at Roaring Camp, young Norm Clark had just $25 in his pocket. Then, from the forest and the rusted iron, he carved and welded his dream. 5 years later, Roaring Camp's first scheduled passenger train climbed the grade toward Bear Mountain and, by day's end, carried 44 revenue passengers.
Roaring Camp went on to become one of the premier attractions in Northern California. In 1985, Norman Clark realized another dream with the purchase of the Southern Pacific Line to Santa Cruz. Unfortunately, this man of vision never got to see full service restored to these tracks, as F. Norman Clark died in December of 1985. Although Mr. Clark passed away, his dream did not, and the railroad line to Santa Cruz, now known as the Santa Cruz Big Trees and Pacific, offers Roaring Camp patrons a new and exciting ride.
The big trees out here on the coast of California are properly called Sequoia sempervirens, which means the ever-living coastal redwood tree, one of two types of redwood we have here in California. You can identify these giant trees by their bark, which has got grooves in it. It's kind of fuzzy. The big tree off to the right of our locomotive there, 1,300 years old. Look at the burn marks on that tree from the fires that used to come through almost every year, about 150 years ago. In 1891, Benjamin Harrison, who was President of the United States, rolled through here on a narrow gauge train and enjoyed the scenery. And in 1901, William McKinley stopped in this grove here. But the most famous president of all to come through here came through in 1903. It was in 1903 that the teddy bear himself, Mr. Teddy Roosevelt, rolled through here on his narrow gauge train and asked for the train to be stopped right here in the grove. And he walked down off the train and into the redwood trees. And next thing you know, there was a panic in the Secret Service because they had lost track of the President of the United States. Well, it just turns out that the President had walked inside a nice big hollow redwood tree and sat down to take a little nap. Now the bridge that we'll be crossing on here in just a moment says 1909 up on the girder, and that was when it was placed here as one of the last phases of standard gauging this railroad line after the 1906 earthquake that wrecked San Francisco. This bridge was placed here, replacing a long wooden trestle that spanned the river here prior to 1909. But notice the forest around here looks much different than on that behind us. That's because the lumberjacks cut every single redwood tree down on this side of the river, clear-cut the entire area 90 years ago. And if you look, you can see the stumps of the original redwoods off to the left with brand new trunks growing right up around them. And those trunks are coming out of the original root systems of the earlier trees that were cut down.
This was originally Mr. Clark's goal, was to get a hold of this line, and after the floods of '82, the terrible storms, we finally got this line, and it's well over 100 years old. It was considered probably the most scenic route that Southern Pacific ever took, along the South Pacific Coast, the railroad that preceded it, the same thing. It's along a river canyon, and you're looking down into that river aspect, crossing steel bridges built in 1909 and big cement arches built into the side of a mountain that initially was blasted out by Chinese railroad workers, some of them that had been on the Transcontinental Railroad. There's just an awful couple of neat wood-lined tunnels that you see, one with a curve in it and one that's close to 1,000 feet long.
The beautiful forest that attracts passengers today is in fact the reason rails were built here in the first place. In 1874, construction was begun on the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad, which was built to haul timber out of the area. This narrow gauge line was eventually extended from Santa Cruz to San Francisco. In 1877, it was sold to the Southern Pacific in standard gauge by 1909.
I started in 1946 with Southern Pacific and retired 40 years later. Oh, I used to fire the suntans up here when they used to have the old suntans and specials. I really liked that. see all those nuts climbing all over the engines. Rail fans, that is. And I fired a lot of helpers when they had two trains, one train up here to the sand plant and a train up to Davenport. We always had the steam helpers on those. And that was interesting. I really enjoyed that. And then it gets pretty hot around here too on the steam engine. Our train right now is really relaxing. I like it. This is my third season back with Roaring Camp, and I really enjoy my job.
Who could not enjoy getting paid to glide through scenery such as this? Once the train reaches Santa Cruz, it leaves the forest environment behind and presents an entirely new picture to the passengers.
We come in through the sort of the back door of Santa Cruz, which is kind of neat. Our 6th tunnel goes underneath the site of the Santa Cruz Mission.
As soon as the train leaves tunnel number 6, it offers another treat for the passengers by running right down the middle of the street. Arrival in Santa Cruz is one of the most unique experiences in all of Roaring Camp. The train backs into town by going right past the beach and onto the boardwalk.